Richard, thanks for your time as always. This Glencore story is a pretty big deal, judging by the reaction in its share price. I mean, tell us exactly what is the U.S. Department of Justice suspecting Glencore for doing?
Right, Fifi. I mean, it's quite a complex subpoena, really, and it relates to times dating back all the way to 2007. Now, remember, Glencore was essentially a company that's fraught with all sorts of shenanigans and doesn't exactly have a very plain sailing history. It was incidentally the company that was originally started by the infamous Mark Rich. And remember, Glencore was listed in May 2011.
Sure.
So the Department of Justice has now subpoenaed Glencore and said, please provide us for documents relating to these countries that you correctly stated, Venezuela, the DRC, and Nigeria, hardly bastions for corporate governance and business practices that anybody really thinks are found with any amount of anything to do with with something that we see a huge amount of transparency in. So the Department of Justice and the SEC essentially put this act together, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Okay. And this act was put together in 2012. And effectively what it says, and I quote, is that when corrupt business practices happen, it is the consumer that loses, and companies that are transparent and honest are put at a disadvantage. And corruption is something that's endemic. It's very much associated with the disassociation or the disallocation or the correct allocation of scarce resources. And when that happens, consumers obviously lose, and also, the world loses, sure. And people in the populace of those countries are losing.
Right.
So, I mean, we know that that Nigeria and Venezuela and the DRC are countries where Glencore has significant assets. In the DRC, for instance, the operations account for about $6 billion of revenue. So that's relatively significant, and it's likely to be that they're certainly going to face some or other fine
as a result. I mean, Richard, so what exactly are they implying here possibly? So they're alleging that Glencore could have possibly paid bribes to possibly get deals or maybe tenders from government in these countries basically for the past decade.
Yeah, I mean, and it's highly likely. I mean, as I mentioned, these are not countries that are bastions of corporate governance or, disclosure where business is done in a manner that is necessarily always above board. So, I mean, it's highly probable. And the Glencore is a company that's a kind of an amalgamation of various trading and commodity producing companies that has evolved to what the listed entity is today, and the listed entity that listed in 2011. And all of a sudden they are now bound by rules and regulations and anti-money laundering practices and corrupt foreign practices. And these were laws that were only promulgated or only came into force in November 2012, as I mentioned, and
But then, can Glencore, if found to have practiced or participated in these corrupt practices prior to the law coming into effect, these laws regressive, whereby Glencore can be found guilty for something that wasn't law when it was practicing it?
Yeah, I mean, that's not for me to really pass comment, but I certainly believe that the long arm of the law has a catch-all, and your retrospective mishandling
sure.
of business practices is not exactly likely to be in the strength in their hand.
Richard, you were telling me before we started the show, is it $9 billion wiped off their market cap so far this morning? Yeah,
that's right. So, I mean, the share price has been down anywhere between 13 and 10%. It was kind of an immediate reaction as soon as the subpoena came out. And the market kind of always overreacts. Glencore does trade at a discount to the other commodity producers.
Sure.
And I think it's a function of the fact that there are these aspects associated with corruption that have always been there.
So they've always been there. So is this why we're seeing a marginal recovery in Glencore off its lowest levels today? Some investors are coming in to buy it at a much steeper discount now that we're looking at, to say that, I mean, this has always been part of Glencore's history. This will blow over. If they have to pay a fine, it's fine, but Glencore's still an investable company. Well,
I mean, as I mentioned, so 9 billion has been written off of the market cap this morning already. And the biggest component of those three countries, as I mentioned, is the DRC, which accounts for 6 billion of revenue. So if they get a fine, it's likely to be in the magnitude of a couple of billion. It'll be stretched out for a while. And as such, this really probably does appear to be some sort of buying opportunity. But I think importantly, it really puts a cloud over Glencore, and there are all sorts of questions on maybe some of the other jurisdictions that they operate in, and maybe this is going to have some sort of further widening effect into investigation in certain other jurisdictions, and just kind of puts a huge amount of uncertainty over the entity that, in my opinion, has certainly always been fraught with complexity and perhaps questionable business ethics.
I mean, you are essentially investigating a decade-long worth of practices. I imagine that it's going to take quite a long time for the U.S. Department of Justice to put this investigation to bed.
Yeah, but look, corruption is something that the world is pretty much against at the moment for all the right reasons. And if you want to be a listed entity and trade in multiple jurisdictions and be open to the capital markets and attract debt and equity finance from multi-jurisdictions across the world, including the US, which is one of the biggest and most sophisticated capital markets, then you need to be bound by the laws and the ethics commissions that are essentially set up in those countries. And we've seen even topical companies or organizations like FIFA are certainly within the catch-all of the Department of Justice and the SEC. So this doesn't bode well for Glencore. Certainly, it is a buying opportunity given that it's come off as much as it has, but it certainly shouldn't suggest that there aren't likely to be some other practices that are questionable and that might come to light in times ahead.
I mean, you say Glencore was founded by, is it Mark Rich? Right now, who's at the helm? Is it Ivan Glaskenberg?
Yeah, Glaskenberg, yeah.
So I imagine that he'll have a lot to answer for from shareholders. I mean, and I say this because right now we've got Sibanye Gold, who is potentially facing a class action lawsuit from U.S. investors or shareholders there, saying that they have lost a lot as a result of its problems here that have caused a marked deterioration in its share price. So, I mean, if this continues to hang over Glencore like a cloud, we could see Ivan Glaskenberg also facing the wrath of his shareholders.
No, absolutely, and he's been there for a while. He's been there since 2002. It remains to be seen how they respond to it. To start with, it's been a bit of a matter of fact, out of hand, and they'll look into it and respond in due course. But these mineral-producing companies, resource-producing companies, have long had a checkered history in operating in jurisdictions that are fraught with complexity and are often very closely associated with dealing with all sorts of despots and the leaders in these areas. And it's without question that attaining these licenses and rights to mine in various areas throughout the world has always been fraught with complexity, and that's essentially a smart way of saying, without question, corrupt practices are something that have been endemic for many, many decades.